Hi, my name is Kira Lee-Genzel, and my personal lecture is a cross-cultural examination of adolescent autonomy. I'll begin with a quick introduction by reviewing what we've learned about autonomy. As we've learned, there's three major components when looking at autonomy, and those are emotional, behavioral, and cognitive. Emotional autonomy is when people begin to feel separate from their parents, and there are several different processes that take place during this time, such as detachment and de idealization. We also have behavioral autonomy, which has to do with decision making and taking actions on your own. And finally, we have cognitive or value autonomy, which is the development of your own values, morals, and beliefs. Now, over the course of adolescence, people begin to have increased autonomy in all three areas, but this presentation will focus mainly on the first two, emotional and behavioral autonomy. We know that autonomy increases throughout adolescence, but the focus of this presentation is to see whether there are cultural differences in the trends that we've learned. One of the main theoretical bases for emotional autonomy that arises during adolescence comes from Anna Freud, who came up with the idea of detachment, in which adolescents feel more distant from their parents, leading to a time of more stress and turmoil. Individualization also takes place, in which an adolescent learns to be a more independent person. Along with that, adolescents begin to see their parents in a more realistic light and no longer idealize them, which is a process known as de idealization. But most importantly, relevant in looking at cultural differences, in my opinion, is that parenting styles are known to greatly impact an adolescent's feelings of autonomy. We've learned that authoritative parenting, in which parents lay clear rules but explain their reasoning behind them and are open to compromise, produces adolescents with the greatest autonomy. We've also learned that different cultures and ethnicities have different parent-child relationships. For example, Asian adolescents tend to feel closer to their parents than their peers, while for most other cultures, it is the opposite. So, in this project, I looked at whether these cultural differences among families have an effect on the beginning of autonomy and its overall trends. Empirical basis. So, most of the studies done on autonomy in adolescence has focused on European American cultures. An interesting study written by Ray Lake et al. Found that overall both behavioral and emotional autonomy increase over time, with adolescents showing lowest levels of autonomy in social, conventional, and prudential matters. Those include chores and health related matters such as scheduling doctor's appointments. In general, girls show higher levels of behavioral autonomy than boys, and we also know that authoritative parenting leads to greater levels of autonomy among adolescents. Another interesting study conducted by Kagetsubasi showed that Asian and Hispanic cultures have a greater sense of familial respect and obligation, which decreases an adolescent's likelihood of going against their parents' wishes. In Asia, for example, children begin contributing to household income at a much younger age than in European American households. Because of this, adolescents' autonomy is not as valued because an independent child is more likely to leave the home and look at his or her self interest rather than the family's. In Western industrialized societies, in contrast, they reflect an individualistic worldview, and in this type of society, autonomy is valued as adolescents are expected to grow up and be self sufficient. Finally, ethnic minority families living in North America and Europe often involve greater control from parents. This makes sense because immigrant families may not be familiar with the cultures that they've moved into, and therefore feel less comfortable with sending their children off on their own. A study done by Fuligny produced this bar chart showing the frequency of disagreement between adolescents and their mothers across 4 cultures from the 6th to the 10th grade. As you can see from the graph, the data did not find significant changes in autonomy from the 6th to 9th grade. They all showed some kind of increase from when they were measured in grade 6 until they were measured again in grade 9. What this study found was that culture did not seem to be a great predictor of adolescent autonomy. Regions seem to have a greater effect, particularly when comparing rural versus urban areas. In rural and low socioeconomic backgrounds, where parents rely on children as a source of income for the family, autonomy seems to decrease. An interesting find was that after controlling for generational differences, ethnic differences were found to be insignificant. And again, all cultures showed increased autonomy from 6th to 10th grade. Why is this topic significant and what implications does it have for future research? Autonomy in adolescence, specifically across cultures, is an important topic to study in order to help reduce the stress and turmoil that is typically thought of when we think of detachment and autonomy during this period of development. When looking at the results of this study, it's important for researchers to keep in mind that overall patterns among a particular group or culture aren't always going to be the same for everyone in that group, but they can be a good basis for designing interventions that can help a majority of the people. Finally, the information that we've learned from this presentation can lead to further research on immigrant families and helping them with the transition to the new environment and beliefs regarding the autonomy of their children. These are the references that I used in my presentation. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed.